Roy on 22nd of May as the Renaissance Day. The triumvirate of Ram Mohan Roy, Rabindranath Tagore, and Satyajit Ray captured the essence of Renaissance, which celebrates multicultural and aesthetics in its finest form. I was fortunate to be a part of this resplendent tradition. I wish the webinar all the best.
Those were a few warmest regards sent by Madam Sharmila Tagore. Wish that she could be.
Namaskar.
We wish that she could be here with us for this instant, but she wasn't able to join. And thanks a lot to Ms. Tagore. Moving forward, I would like to ask Professor Chatterjee to give an overview of the whole event as to what we are planning ahead. And Professor Chatterjee is the Regional Director of IIMC Dhenkanal. Earlier, he has worked with Samvad and leading Oriya Delhi, and he has been practicing journalism for over a decade. So, please, Professor Chatterjee, over to you. Give us an overview.
Thank you. Today happens to be the 250th birth anniversary of Raja Ram Mohan Rai. Raja Ram Mohan Rai is widely believed to be the harbinger of Renaissance in India. Before I move to the concept of Renaissance and Renaissance in India, let me first talk for a couple of minutes on Raja Ram Mohan Rai and the time when he was born. Raja Ram Mohan Rai was born exactly 65 years after Aurangzeb's death and exactly 15 years after the Battle of Parasta. The situation was that the hold of Mughal Empire was going away. And British East India Company has not yet taken over. That is the situation where there were, I will not use this word anarchy, but the social cohesion was not there. It was a time when nobody knew to which direction to move. It was a time when probably the past and present suddenly went into kind of a time wrap. At this juncture was born this man into a wealthy Hindu family in Radhanagar in Hooghly district. Nothing much is known about his childhood days, except for the fact that he moved out of his place to different places, including Patna, including other places, and learned a lot. Learned different languages, learned different scriptures, learned about different religion, and somehow he mastered the quintessence of all religions. And he was very interested into that. Look at this man who by the age of 18 wrote a book, a small slender book. But nevertheless, the content was explosive. He criticized the idolatry of Hindu religion. Consider somebody doing that back in end 18th, early 19th century. Right? He didn't stop there. He moved on, learned more. And we find him in early 19th century working for British East India Company for 10 years or so, in which while he was working in and with British East India Company, we found him taking an interest in Western concepts, Western philosophy. He read them, She probably consumed them voraciously. And then in 1814 was a turning point in the life of Raja Ram Mohan Rai. In 1814, he formed Atmiya Sabha. In Odia, it will be Atmiya Sabha, an organization which kind of like Beyond the Binary, it's a congregation of intellectuals of that time, and they used to talk and discuss about religion and different facets of religion. And from religion, they moved to social aspects as well. So from 1814 onwards, we will find Raja Ram Mohan Rai taking more and more interest in socio-cultural, even political activities of that time. He wanted change. There is a story, I mean, nobody can vouch for sure whether that is true or not, but there is a story that one of his close relations committed sati. And that was a shock to Raja Ram Mohan Rai, and that triggered this within him to oppose this heinous system. And that was the trigger. Many say this, but if nobody is sure about this fact, but everybody is sure about this fact that over 600 brides were burned in this sati system. Right. So he tried to oppose this system from 1814 onwards. In fact, he wrote a book in 1818 or something. He started a couple of newspapers, from Brahmanical magazine in English to Shambat Kaumundi in Bangla to Miratul Akhbar in Persian. And that was the first Persian magazine in India, and some say in the world, because in Iran, the Persian magazine came much later. So he also talked about press freedom. He talked about reforms, administrative reforms, social reforms. He tried to bring about reforms in education and many other things. Now let's come to Renaissance. Renaissance, which means a resurrection, which means taking interest into something in the past, right? The rebirth. This was a great European transitional movement that swept away the quote-unquote medieval unprogressive ideas and replaced with individualism, material emancipation, skepticism, nationalism, and more sound economic system and self-expression, individual freedom. All these are constructs of Renaissance. Renaissance refers to the revival of classics, but not in the sense that we go back to the past without examining it. Renaissance entails examining the past and taking cue from the past and bridge it with future, which Raja Ram Mohan Rai did. Probably he was the harbinger. His prayers over different religious texts made him eminently capable of drawing from our scriptures arguments to counter the argument of the people who were supporting sati. Right? Consider this fact that it took him over 10 years when Lord Bentinck, right, promulgated this act banning sati in 1829. It took him over 10, 12, 15 years of consistent, campaign. Now, an inquiry into the past and an assessment of the strength of tradition to overcome contemporary problems, this was a defining feature of Renaissance. And Raja Ram Mohan Rai did it. probably did it for the first time in India, and he was followed by others. And we will come to that in a few minutes from now. So Raja Rammohan Rai brought in a new thinking, which is not absolutely alien. What he tried to do is to link it with our past. That is what makes the Renaissance in India a kind of a unique Renaissance. We delved deep into our own scriptures, our own religion, and then brought out concepts, brought out arguments, which will link us to the future, which again emphasizes on concepts like individual freedom, like liberty. That again paved the way for nationalism. That is the linkage about which maybe I'll talk a couple of minutes from now. So these social, and Raja Rammohan Rai, as I told you, he started social, cultural, and religious movements. And these movements preceded the political struggles that India was to see from, say, 1920s onwards. And it was regarded as a necessary precursor to the arrival of nationalism. In fact, Raja Rammohan Rai and his emphasis on individual freedom, liberty, the concept of nation and all, this paved the way to crystallize the concept of nationalism. So Indian Renaissance has distinct phases. In the first phase, which Raja Rammohan Rai and his contemporaries started, contemporaries of Brahmo Samaj, Devendranath Tagore and others, Keshav Chandra Sen and others, they started. The first phase of India's Renaissance was embodied mostly in socio-religious movements, which were primarily, but not exclusively, initiated by the country's burgeoning middle class, which was educated in British liberalism. However, the intellectuals who led the movement were not Anglophile Indians. They were rooted in our tradition, our culture. Right? The fact that they targeted the obvious, social obscurantism, religious superstition, and irrational rituals, right, underlying this fact that they were at the same time religious-minded, but forward-looking. But religiosity did not confine them from looking towards the future, from looking towards science, from looking towards modern science. And that is the reason why Raja Rammohan Rai and others who were in Brahmo Samaj, they started education which took in science and mathematics in a big way. Right? Now, the first phase of the Indian Renaissance was primarily concerned with social and cultural issues, as I told you, resulting in a relative neglect of political issues. In fact, politics did not play a significant role in their thinking. However, the seed of individual liberty, the seed of liberty, seed of nationalism was sown, which others carried forward in the second phase. Vidyasagar, others, we may include, and our next speakers will dwell extensively on that. We have a long list of freedom fighters, intellectuals who carried forward this brand of Renaissance in India. Today we are discussing Renaissance, and we are trying to discuss persons who added in this movement that freed India from what I call the mental blocks. We will discuss. I'm looking forward to hear from our resource persons more on that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Chatterjee, for that factual and full of information speech. We really enjoyed it. Up next, we have Dr. Ramakrishna Challa to talk on about the concept of Renaissance in Indian context. Professor Ramakrishna is the chairman of Board of Studies in Journalism and Mass Communication at the Andhra University. He has so far produced 15 PhDs under his supervision and authored 15 books, and have also published quite a number of research articles. We are glad to have you on board with us, Dr. Challa. Over to you.
Thank you, Depon. Good evening, friends. First, let me thank Professor Mrinal ji for giving me this opportunity, even though it is a short notice. And also, let me first congratulate him on the conferment of D.Litt on him. And also, Professor Mishra ji, S.N. Mishra ji, and other dignitaries, and also all the learned participants. Okay. In the history of modern India, the Renaissance is generally marked as the pre-political phase of anti-colonial struggle, a period when Indians were mainly engaged in social and cultural preparation for participation in the more progressive and radical political programs. The social and religious movements, particularly termed as the Renaissance, which preceded the political struggles, are considered a necessary precursor to the coming of nationalism. Hence, nationalism is conceptualized as a natural outcome of the Renaissance. The relationship between modernity and the Renaissance has given rise to a variety of questions. Whether the Renaissance succeeded in resolving the social contradictions that existed in society is one of the important questions. Why the Renaissance did not become transsectional and why it remained religious and caste-oriented is another point to be pondered. An inquiry into the relationship between Renaissance and modernity may provide answers to some of these questions as we all going to discuss. The origin of modernity in India is often attributed to the intellectual and cultural efflorescence associated with the Renaissance. The Renaissance marked a period of transition of values, transformation in social sensibilities, and rebirth of cultural activity. The outcome of these processes was the emergence of a new man with cultural and intellectual attributes different from his past, as already discussed by our learned friend, Mrinal ji. These ideas inspired an upsurge of creative energy, leading to the works of masters in painting, sculpture, literature, music, and so on. The beginning of modernity was heralded not by the arrival of the West in India, but by the onset of social and religious reforms, which is popularly called the Renaissance, following the European experience. But reform is not Renaissance, which in fact is the expression of a much larger social and intellectual awakening. Its beginning is traced to the efforts of Raja Ram Mohan Roy in Bengal, as just now our good friend spoke about Raja Ram Mohan Rai, to ameliorate the conditions of life of women and to reform religious practices. Like Raja Ram Mohan Rai in Andhra Pradesh, we have Kandukuri Veeresalingam Pantulu also. He was a social reformer. Here, let me discuss about the contributions of Raja Ram Mohan Rai to the growth of language journalism, because we are all students of journalism. Let me discuss about the growth of language journalism in India as well as Renaissance. As we all know, Raja Ram Mohan Rai took to journalism by force, not by choice, because he was forced to take up journalism. Thanks to Samachar Darpan or Serampur missionaries, we can call them the Christian missionaries. They forced him to become a journalist. Samachar Darpan, the magazine of Serampur Christian missionaries, had launched a criticism of Vedanta philosophy, and the magazine also invited replies to this criticism. And Raja Ram Mohan Rai, who was the man of vision and was known for his patriotism, vigor, dynamism, patience, persistence, and politeness, he sent to the editor of Samachar Darpan through a letter his personal views on the subject. Despite voluntary invitation extended by the magazine, that is Samachar Darpan, the letter was refused to be published. Then Raja Ram Mohan Rai was keen about some reply to the mischievous attacks made on Hindu philosophical thought. With the main intention of answering the criticisms made by the Samachar Darpan, he issued a magazine called Brahmanical Magazine. 12 issues were released, and the editor's name was given as Shiva Prasad Sharma, who was a Pandit friend of Raja Ram Mohan Rai. I think that was the Samachar Darpan. Thanks to Samachar Darpan, we could able to make Raja Ram Mohan Rai to lead the language journalism in India. Later, a regular periodical in English and Bengali with the title Brahmin Sevadi, another paper. Brahmin Sevadi was started by Raja Ram Mohan Rai. In this bilingual magazine, not only were attacks on Vedanta refuted, but counter questions were also raised and posed on the authenticity of the concepts of Christian religion. Okay. When in 1819, press regulations were relaxed and strict censorship uniformly imposed by the British government was removed to a great extent, then Raja Ram Mohan Rai was alert to seize that opportunity, and he seriously examined how journalism could be conducted on purely Indian lines. Okay. With the foresight, he had realized the potentialities of the press. His plans materialized when the Sambad Kaumidi made its appearance in 1821.
Thank you, Professor Goswami.
It was purely an Indian venture. The Calcutta Journal, edited by James Silk Buckingham, gave ample publicity. And because James Silk Buckingham, he was a good friend of Raja Ram Mohan Rai, and they gave ample publicity in its columns to this, the new Indian project, Sambad Kaumidi. Buckingham was a very close friend, and they used to meet in the evenings and discuss matters of common interest. The weekly was printed at the Sanskrit press, and later it was shifted to Unitarian press, which was established by Raja Ram Mohan Rai, and he got his own types, and he has his own men to conduct the journalism and the printing press. So in 1821 again, another paper was published by Raja Ram Mohan Rai, that was Miratul Akbar, in Persian language, because the Persian language was the court language in those days, and it was called Mirror of News. Miratul Akbar means Mirror of News. Persian was a court language, as already discussed, and it was widely used by the masses and classes at that time. So the editorials written in Miratul Akhbar were the result of deep thinking about fundamental truths and doctrines, and the English weekly Calcutta Journal, edited by James Silk Buckingham, they used to reproduce the editorials written in Miratul Akhbar in Calcutta Journal, and his editorials, the editorials of Raja Ram Mohan Rai, irritated the government and led to the enactment of John Adams' Vernacular Press Act of 1823. And that act placed greater restrictions on freedom of press. Then Raja Ram Mohan Rai, he was one of the greatest Indian reformers of modern times. He belongs to the galaxy of builders of modern India and can more appropriately be called the father of modern English language journalism. Even in his early life, he showed himself a prodigy. He had a wonderful memory and a brilliant intellect. Keeping pace with the times, he learned Persian, Arabic, and Bengali. He was sent to Patna, then it was the center of Islamic culture and higher studies, for an advanced course by his father, and he soon acquired a spiritual vision and defeated his own instructor in scholarly debates and discussions. When he returned to the village at the age of 16 as a changed man, and there were differences arose between him and his father over religious ideas. I think this was the fundamental thing which changed him and which made him as a reformer, because he had differences with his father about the religious ideas, and his open condemnation of Hindu idolatry infuriated his parents and the other members of the family. He was so disgusted with the treatment meted out to him in the house, and he left his home again. To quench the thirst of acquiring knowledge and experience, he traveled to Tibet and spent time, almost 4 years, in Trans-Himalayan region, studying much about the Buddhist faith. Personal homage, that is worship of Lama in Tibet, was disfavored by him, and his open criticism of this common mode of worship was seriously viewed by the inhabitants, and they wanted to even kill him. So fortunately, a Tibetan woman was kind enough to save him at the right time, and this incident made him an unfailing worshipper of womankind. When he stayed to come back to the paternal home after 4 years of wanderings and in and around Himalayas, he was accorded a warm welcome by the family as a young rebel. He was a rebel and who had already acquired a passion for truth. Okay, he was a truth seeker. Later, he decided to live in Varanasi as a copyist. His father supplemented his meager income with periodical gifts, and when his father died in 1803, there was a division of the family property, and his mother wanted to disinherit him on the ground of disbelief in Hindu religion. Raja Ram Mohan Rai defended himself before the judge and came out victorious in the lawsuit, but out of generosity, he did not take any portion of his father's property. And he had a scholarly bent of mind, and he pursued his studies, and at the age of 22, he learned English, understanding its supreme significance and its potentialities for the future of India. He published many books advocating monotheism in Persian language. In 1803, he entered the Bengal civil service as a clerk, and by 1814, he rose to the position of a Diwan, and his immediate superior, John Digby, was very affectionate towards him. And retiring from this service in 1814, he took up residence in Calcutta with enough money, and he went on propagating his views on religion. His techniques was threefold. He convinced people by conversation and discussion. One. Second one, he aroused public conscience by writing and publication. Then the third one, finally he gathered around him firm and faithful associates. And Raja Ram Mohan Roy, as we discussed, he was a social and religious reformer. He wielded his powerful pen against the image worship and the most horrible custom of the burning of Hindu widows alive with the bodies of their dead husbands. So that was sati. It was a barbarous practice practiced by the Hindus in those days. He founded schools to provide modern education and also he organized the societies for proper forms of worship. His ideal was to make the government constitutional, and also the government has to follow the established law. And he wanted modern science to be wedded with culture. Okay. As a Renaissance, the founder of Renaissance, we can call him, because he wanted the scientific temper to be given to our culture. As a fighter for the rights of women, as a great social reformer, with the defined standards and the founder of Brahmo Samaj, he will be remembered long in the history. And he, as I said, he died on September 27th, 1833, and was buried at Stapleton Grove, Bristol in England. He went to England on the invitation of Buckingham, and he wrote, I will quote, "My only object is that I may lay before the public such articles of intelligence and may increase their experience and tend to their social improvement, and that to the extent of my abilities, I may indicate to the rulers a knowledge of the real situation of their subjects and make the subjects acquainted with the established laws and customs of their rulers, that the rulers may more readily find an opportunity of granting relief to the people, and the people may be in possession of the means of obtaining protection and redress from the rulers." That was unquote. Because it can be an excellent objective for a journalist. Raja Ram Mohan Roy was the first to interest himself in the above problems and did his best to educate the Indian people. He was a versatile scholar and a linguist. He was born in a time of transition. At a time of transition, and Western culture was trying to get foothold in India, and skepticism and disregard of Hindu ideals were manifest in a class of people. Raja Ram Mohan Roy viewed this with concern and held up before the countrymen the glorious Hindu philosophy and culture. Though Raja Ram Mohan Roy was essentially a social and religious reformer, his contribution to Indian language journalism was great, and it was permanent. Through his numerous periodicals, as I already discussed, the Brahminical magazine, the Brahmin Sevati, Sambad Kaumudi, the Meratullah Khabar, and Bengal Herald. In fact, he carried on his fight for reform through his journals effectively and successfully. Like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, even in Telugu language journalism, we have one great social reformer called Kandukuri Veereselingam Pantulu. He championed for the cause of women empowerment and widow remarriage. He propagated. And he also started newspapers to educate women, to give education to women, and also he encouraged women remarriages, widow remarriages. So in North India, as already discussed by our friend, it took root in the activities of Dayananda Saraswati, and in Maharashtra, the Prardhana Samaj founded by M.G. Ranade, and in Andhra Pradesh, as I already discussed, Kandukuri Veeraselingam Pantulu, and they were all, they can all be called as the founders of Renaissance in those times. The story was slightly different in South India, in Kerala and Tamil Nadu, particularly in Kerala and Tamil Nadu. In both areas, the Renaissance was a slow starter. Okay. And possibly because of the emergence of middle class was relatively late in these regions. In the 19th century, the area which constituted the present Kerala and called Travancore, Coimbatore, Cochin, Malabar, and other areas was an educationally and socially backward region. So was Tamil Nadu. Because Tamil Nadu was the same problem. And what distinguished Tamil Nadu and Kerala experience was its lower caste orientation. Most of the reform movements in this region emerged mainly from the lower class, unlike North Indian Renaissance, which was mainly an upper caste preserve. The reforms initiated by Raja Ram Mohan Roy in Bengal was an upper class movement. Those who followed him belonged to the same group. Okay, Debendranath Tagore and Keshav Chandra Sen in Bengal, Ranade in Maharashtra, Dayananda Saraswati in Punjab, and Veeraselingam Pantulu in Andhra Pradesh. In contrast, the Renaissance in Kerala was led by lower caste reformers such as Narayana Guru and Ayyankali. So was it in Tamil Nadu, where the progress of the lower caste was championed by Periyar E.V. Ramaswamy.
Okay. Dr. Challa, excuse me, please. Sorry to interrupt you in the middle, sir. Sir, it was really wonderful hearing you to go extensive on Dr. Ramon Roy, but we do have among us Mr. Tarun Goswami. He was able to join us at
Okay. I'll finish up. Okay.
Yes, sir. Please wind it up and then we can hear.
And when the national movement gained strength, because I wanted to discuss about South more on Tamil Nadu and Kerala experiences. Okay. But let me conclude because our next speaker is on the right line. Okay. When the national movement gained strength through political struggles like non-cooperation and civil disobedience, the social consciousness was still entrenched on caste and communal feelings. And was it a result of inability to evolve a symbiotic relationship between political and cultural? And as Gandhiji addressed the question by his advocacy of Gram Swaraj and constructive programs. So this was the high point of the second phase of the Renaissance. Already our good friend Mrinal discussed about various phases. And let me conclude by saying the Renaissance was not an event. It was a process, and its attributes underwent changes whenever major shifts took place in society and the economy. So socialist humanism not only aims at an egalitarian socio-political order, it also envisions cultural and intellectual freedom. The violence and intolerance rampant in society today is not so much the failure of the Renaissance, but as the inability to transform its values in accordance with the demands of the present. So the material world is changing, but the cultural climate remains stagnant and if not deteriorating. So hence it is time to think about the next phase of Indian Renaissance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much. We have among us Mr. Tarun Goswami. He was able to join for a few minutes. We are very glad to have you on board, sir. Mr. Goswami is currently the resident editor of the English daily Millennium Post, Kolkata. He has earlier worked for the Statesman also. And now we'll be glad to hear from Mr. Goswami to speak about Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Rabindranath Tagore, and other Renaissance persons. Over to you, Mr. Goswami.
Sorry for joining late. Am I audible?
Yes, you are
Yes.
audible.
Yes, sir. You are audible, sir. Yes.
Yes. Sorry for joining late. I was listening to a wonderful speech, and I'm really sorry that it got interrupted because of my presence.
No,
And I
not
should
at
be
all, sir. It was not at all, sir. Don't.
Raja, Sir Edward Hyde East, he was the Chief Justice of Supreme Court between 1813 and 1822. And Sir Edward Hyde East, he wanted opinion of Bengal intellectuals over setting up of an institution where the medium of instruction will be English. And he invited some Bengali intellectuals. David Hare was there. It was in 1815. And the meeting was held in Edward Hyde's residence. And after the meeting was over, Hyde wrote a letter to his friend in England that during the meeting, a tall Brahmin stood up and insisted that there should be an English medium institution in Bengal. I think that he was Ram Mohan. Ram Mohan is still unknown to me. So in 1815, Raja Ram Mohan Rai was unknown to Edward Hyde East. Edward Hyde East later became the first principal of Hindu College, and Ram Mohan Rai, Mrityunjay Tarkalankar, and David Hare were the three main figures in setting up Hindu College, which later came to be known as Presidency College. Raja Ram Mohan Rai was the first Indian who realized that unless India comes close to West, unless there is exchange of views, India cannot grow. He studied Vedanta very seriously and wrote a treatise on the philosophy of Vedanta. He also gave a commentary on Vedanta Shar. He also wrote on the Upanishads. But India's greatest tragedy was that India, unfortunately, closed its meeting with the West. So Ram Mohan Rai's legacy, whether it was a renaissance or not, is a matter of opinion. I am not going into that. When Ram Mohan Rai died in Bristol in 1833, Brahmo Samaj was a pregnant concept. It was given life by Ramchandra Vidyavagish and Devendranath Tagore in 1843 when they set up Tattvabodhini Sabha and Tattvabodhini Patrika. In 1828, Ram Mohan set up Brahmo. He couldn't set up Brahmo Samaj, but Brahmo Sabha he set up. And through Brahmo Samaj, the evils of Hindu society got projected. My interest is that after Raja went to the West and he talked about Vedanta there, he was the first person to preach Vedanta in the West. You know, Sanskrit language and Vedanta, they are becoming very popular in the West now. In Heidelberg University, they have summer classes, and the population is growing up so fast that they are increasing the number of schools and institutions where Sanskrit is being taught. In England, in 125 public schools, the second language is Sanskrit. And the philosophy of Vedanta is becoming very popular in the West, along with the philosophy of yoga. They are practicing asana for physical fitness, but the philosophy of yoga is also becoming popular in the West. So Ram Mohan Rai was the first man who realized that unless we open up and unless there is interchange of views, India cannot grow. Because there was a view in India that there is everything in the Vedas. So we are not ready to accept the West. Two people carried on the legacy of Ram Mohan. The first person was Vivekananda when he delivered the World's Parliament of Religion in Chicago in 1893. There he first talked about mingling of West and East, and he gave 6 lectures. In all these lectures, we find that he gave highest point to humanity in all these lectures. In the last lecture, he said that upon the banner of every religion will soon be written, in spite of great resistance, help and not fight, assimilation and not destruction, harmony and peace and not dissension. He came in contact with Western intellectuals like Friedrich Max Müller, John Wayne, Paul Deussen, and Paul Deusen's love for Vivekananda was that he could speak with Vivekananda in Sanskrit. Paul Deussen preferred to speak in Sanskrit. Vivekananda met Max Müller in Oxford. John Wayne, the father of Venn diagram in statistics and logic, he also came in contact with Vivekananda. In America, he came in contact with Nikola Tesla, with John Wright and other intellectuals. And through these intellectuals, he preached Vedanta in American society, and it was of great importance. When he visited the United States for the second time in 1899, he had delivered 170 lectures, but unfortunately his shorthand writer Goodwin had died, so we do not get any of the lectures in full. Vivekananda believed that India should come to the West, and when he published Udbodhan, the Bengali organ of Ramakrishna Mission in 1899, he said that the main purpose of Udbodhan will be mingling of West and East. Vivekananda always believed that from West we should learn science, and in return we should give them philosophy and religion. This was his unique view. So also Tagore. When Tagore came in contact with the Western intellectuals, his first story in Bengali, Kabuliwala, was translated by Sister Nivedita. Sister Nivedita told Yeats that always remember that this man is not merely a poet, he is basically a saint. The saintliness of Tagore was respected by all, including an atheist like Bertrand Russell. Russell met Tagore in 1906 in London, and later he wrote a letter to Ottolin Morel, where he said that I was inspired by his saintliness. India should become a member of international fraternity, and that is only possible through English language. So Raja Ram Mohan Rai preferred that English should be the medium of instruction in India. We should learn our vernacular. At the same time, we should keep our minds open, and we should understand and read an international language to communicate our views. Because India's rich philosophy, India's rich thought should reach the Western Hemisphere. Earlier, the Westerners, they didn't know about India. To them, India was a dark nation where mothers threw their children in the rivers to be devoured by the crocodiles. The Indians didn't put on garments. Their deity was without clothes, and these things they believed. Slowly and slowly, their respect for India increased, and this was possible first because of Ram Mohan and then because of Vivekananda and Rabindranath Tagore. If we read Rabindranath's Nobel Prize acceptance speech, which he delivered in Stockholm in 1921, we'll be able to understand what when Tagore was saying about the mixing of East and West. He said that because Western world used to look at us with suspicion, and because we had also certain reservations, our thought process didn't grow. Over the years, the philosophy has changed, and now because of intermixing of the two philosophies, when Professor Radhakrishnan went to Oxford and became the Spalding professor, then Western world came to know about certain philosophies like Nyaya Vaisheshika philosophy, Mimamsa and Vedanta philosophy. After that, Professor Bimal Krishna Motilal, he became the Spalding professor in Oxford, and Western world came to know about the Nyaya philosophy, the sharp logic which was given by our predecessors, by the rishis in India. Ram Mohan believed that to save the world, mixing of thought is required, and every thought should give human beings the topmost priority. Unless human beings are respected, unless women are respected, world cannot grow. Unfortunately, we live in a world where there is suspicion, where there is hatred is going up, going every day. There is suspicion, and people are more attracted by the worldly affairs and not by intellectual pursuit. On 250th birth anniversary of Ram Mohan, we should take a pledge that we should read and be intellectually sound. One aspect of Ram Mohan we should always remember, that he was a great musician. He had composed many songs in Bengali which are of immense importance. He also gave the tunes and wrote the songs. One famous song composed by Ram Mohan was মনে মনে হয় শেষের সেদিন ভয়ঙ্কর, অন্যে বাক্য কবে, মনে রেখো শেষের সেদিন ভয়ঙ্কর, অন্যে বাক্য কবে কিন্তু তুমি রবে নিরুত্তর. Remember always the last day when others will speak and you will be forced to keep mum. He cautioned people that unless you live a good life, unless you live an ethical life, then on the final day of judgment, others will speak and you will be forced to keep mum. And if you lead a good life, then you will be also taking part in the discussion on your last day of judgment. Ram Mohan Roy was a great musician. He was a great connoisseur of good food. He used to entertain people with good food, and he was also interested in dress. He always put up. He was a wrestler. He had very good physique and used to put on good garments so that people got attracted towards Ram Mohan. He was a very soft-spoken person, though he had enormous physical and mental strength. At a time when people are suffering from depression, at a time when people do not know where to go and how to lead a good life, persons like Ram Mohan are there to inspire us and give us the direction. With these few words, I conclude my speech. I tender my apology for joining this meeting late. As I'm a journalist, I was busy writing my editorial in Kolkata. So thanks for giving me an opportunity to share my views with you. On this special occasion, I convey my respect to Raja Ram Mohan Rai and seek blessings from him.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Goswami. It's been an absolute delight to hear you talk about Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Rabindranath Tagore, and other Renaissance persons in India. Up next, we have Professor Mishra to speak about the last of the Renaissance persons, Girish Karnar especially. Professor Mishra is the Dean of Kids School of Management, and his interests range across a wide spectrum, starting from constitutional law to even being a film buff. So we are very eager to hear what Professor Mishra has to say about the last of the Renaissance persons. Over to you, Professor Mishra.
Good evening, friends. After this scholarly presentations by my distinguished colleagues, Professor Mrinal Chatterjee, Dr. Ramakrishna, and Mr. Goswami, I will confine myself to a more recent Renaissance person who died about 3 years back, Girish Karnar. Dipan, could you kindly open this? Yeah. I plan to make a quick presentation in about 15 minutes about the last Renaissance person. But before I do that, next one. Before I do that, next, Dipan. Can you move the slide, Dipan? Can you change the slide, Dipal? Yeah. 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 My predecessors, previous speakers have adequately covered Raja Rammohn Roy. I just want to add to whatever scholastic contributions that they had, that Raja Rammohn Roy was also one of the first, person who pleaded for property inheritance rights of women. Way back in 1828, as you know, in India, inheritance rights for women came in 1956. And Raja Rammohn Roy was one of the first proponents of inheritance rights. And as we all know that his Brahma Sabha, which was set up in 1828, segued into the Brahma Samaj movement. And we have very, very prominent persons like Rabindranath Tagore and Satyajit Ray, who are not only exceptionally sensible, very original, but they were, I think, really global persons. They had wonderful global connectivity. Today, when we talk of nationalism, I'm completely amazed by Tagore's vision of in the world being a global village. I recall in 2009, when I went to Moscow, along with Mr. Antony, my defense minister, he insisted on visiting a small cottage of the Russian poet Sergei Yesenin. This was located about 60 kilometers from Moscow on the banks of Volga River. And after we saw the place, a very small place, then the person who had taken us showed us the visitor's book. And one of the very interesting things that we noticed was that Tagore had visited Sergei Yesenin in 1930. He had gone to Russia in 1930. And he had written that I spent 3 wonderful days with Sergei. Very, very few people know what a wonderful poet of nature he is. I consider him as good as Wordsworth, if not better. I hope I'll come back again and meet him. This was in 1930, 5th September 1930. My heart swelled with pride that here is a person, here is a Nobel laureate who could interact with a Russian poet. And there was a, there was a culmination of minds. Next one. Now, before I come to Girish Kannad and spend a couple of minutes on the genesis of the Renaissance movement, Professor Mrinal did mention that essentially Renaissance, manifested a new thinking in art, architecture, politics, science, and literature. But very interestingly, it started in the Republic of Florence. Now, people keep on asking, why Florence? Why not any other city? Now, very interestingly, there's a wonderful book. Next one, Dipan. There's a very wonderful book by Eric Weiner, Geography of the Genius. He mentions why it was Florence, which was the cradle of Renaissance movement. Now, he writes that Florence was not a natural location. Like Calcutta, it was swampy, it was malarial, it was also prone to Biconic plague, and it was also surrounded by bellicose neighbors. Now then, how did it happen in Florence? Such a magnificent artistic world by people like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo. Why did it happen? So he quotes Plato, who wrote in 360 BC in Republic. These words actually you find mention, you go to Greece, you find at several places, you find a mention of this 8 words of Plato. What he said was, what is honored in a country will be cultivated there. What is honored in a country will be cultivated there. And Eric Wener writes that Athens honored wisdom, therefore it got Socrates. Rome honored power, it got Roman Empire. And Florence honored art, it got Leonardo da Vinci. So basically, friends, it all depends on what we consider to be a matter of honor. And very interestingly, he mentions that on 25th January 1504, 100 artists, including Leonardo, Michelangelo, Botticelli, they congregated in Florence. And the whole idea was to choose a location to display the city's latest masterpiece. I have put here, David. This was done by Michelangelo. And very interestingly, all these artists didn't see eye to eye, but they were together because they consider that this great masterpiece to be celebrated by everybody. And they were individual geniuses. But when it came to accepting, the qualities of other great artists, they were always together. So Wener writes that Florence midwifed scores of genius and also the importance of individual genius. Next. The very interesting thing also Wener writes that, Michelangelo, the statue that you saw was made out of a block of marble, which was imperfect. It was discarded by several artists. But Michelangelo thought that this defect in the marble piece was itself a challenge, and it could be converted into a great art. So therefore, Florence had also a very interesting workshop, which was led by Verrocchio. Now, Verrocchio was a person who trained several great artists, including Leonardo. But, the philosophy of Verrocchio is very, very interesting. Now, he believed that unlike we management people, we think that creativity is a floating skill. Creativity can be inculcated. So Verrocchio believed that creativity is not a free-floating skill that can be taught. Basically, what can be taught is how to encourage thinking styles, how to find out problem solving. I remember my boss, Dr. Kalam, used to always say that at the end of a presentation, are you able to find a problem? How are you approaching a problem? So therefore, very interestingly, Pablo Picasso, the great painter, once wrote that computers are stupid because they give only answers. They never ask questions. So how do you ask questions? How you change your thinking? That is the way to creativity. Next one. Now let me come to Girish Kannad. My friend, Professor Goel is here. And we were fortunate to have seen some of his great plays, great movies. So I'm very, very happy. We belong to the 17th generation when Mandi House was throbbing with cultural activity. NSD was in full might. Now, very interestingly, Girish Kannad was born in a small place called Dharwad. He did his BA in mathematics from Dharwad because he thought that if he gets a first class, he'll get a scholarship in Oxford. His father was a doctor, forced him to do maths. So he went to Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. And very interestingly, friends, you may not be knowing that Dharwad and Hubli are the only place in India where you have an annual music festival of Hindustani classical singers and Carnataki musicians. It's the only place where you have a confluence of Hindustani music with Carnatic music. And no wonder it has wonderful musical maestros like Gangubai Hangal, Mallikarjun Marjun, Bhimsen Joshi, Kumar Gandhar. So this place has created real geniuses both from down south and north. And very interestingly, when Bharat Ratna Bhimsen Joshi died, somebody asked him that who will be your successor? He said, of course, Arshid Khan. Bhimsen Joshi didn't have to think that he's anointing a Muslim as the successor. That's what music does to you. Now let me talk a little bit about Girish Karnad, the script writer. At the age of 23, he wrote the first script when he was studying in Oxford called Jajati. But the play that really catapulted him to fame was Tughlaq. As I mentioned, we were fortunate to see this play in 1977 in the ramparts of Purana Killa. And this particular play, Tughlaq, was a very interesting play. And it was the first historical drama in Canada. He writes about an eccentric 14th century ruler, Muhammad bin Tughlaq, who actually shifted his capital from Delhi to Daulatabad, about 600 kilometers in Maharashtra, because he thought that this will foster Hindu-Muslim identity. Because he thought that if the capital is in Delhi, it is becoming too much Hindu-oriented. So he was the first champion of secularism. But he didn't realize that when he took his people to Daulatabad, there would be enormous amount of difficulties because the place didn't have adequate water, but he was always ahead of times. Now, very interestingly, Tughlaq was an allegory of the Nehruvian era. Now many people like Girish Karnad were very disappointed because Nehru was one who really fired the imagination of the youth, and people thought that he could do nothing wrong and he will really make India into a real modern state. But when socialism was getting dissipated and India had the Chinese debacle in 1962, so therefore this particular play, while drawing reference to Muhammad bin Tughlaq, also gave a glimpse of how hopes could peter out into disillusionment. Next. And one of the best performances, particularly in play, was in 1972. As I said, in the ramparts of Purana Killa, it was Manohar Singh, who was a great actor. He is no more. And it was directed by Abraham Elkazi, one of the doyens of Indian theatre, and Girish Karnad wrote the script. It was really a cultural crescendo. His other play, which is very important, is Hayabadana in 1971. It was based on Thomas Mann's The Transposed Heads, and Kathasri Sagar, based on an 11th century Sanskrit text. The point I want to mention is that he was one of the very, very few script writers who fused, the Western literature with our ancient text and found some relevance to our modern times. The play which also made him very, very famous was Nagamandala in 1997. And this was basically a play which shows the predicament of women who is a victim of her husband's lust. And he was greatly impacted by Bertolt Brecht's Complex Scene and Kafka's Castle and Camus' The Outsider. So basically, this was a play which was, you can say, a feminist play, where he unraveled the problems that women go through in a marriage. Next. I come to his films. I just would like to discuss 3 films of Karnad. The first film, of course, where he acted was Sanskar in 1970. Now, this was based on a wonderful novel by Anantamurthy, U.R. Anantamurthy, who is a Gyanpith Award in 1965. And it was a blistering attack on the caste system and moral superiority of the Brahmins. It's a very interesting story of 2 Brahmins. One was Girish Karnad, who was very devout, and another Brahmin who used to really indulge in all vices of the world, and he dies. And then suddenly the predicament was that no Brahmin was prepared to touch the dead body. Then how will this dead body be removed? And then suddenly the mistress of this Brahmin, comes to the field, and he tells the Brahmins that I have a lot of gold coins. Whoever would like to pick it up, I will give them gold coins. Then suddenly there was a competition between Brahmins to take out the dead body. So he says, it's a very great, interesting satire, how the same Brahmins who are saying that it's a defiled body are now competing to get gold coins. And this particular movie bit Pratitwandi by Satyajit Ray in getting the National Award, but Girish Karnad wrote to Satyajit Ray, "Sir, it is my tribute to the Guru." The other movie, people don't discuss much is Nisant in 1976. Possibly one of the best movies which captures the conflict in the villages, the caste system, and it had a wonderful assemblage of actors and actresses. You had Nasiruddin Saha, who debuted, Smita Patil, Sabana Azmi, you name everybody. And this was to look at the milk cooperative movement of Varghese Kurian and how powerful, how the collective might can be very, very powerful. Here, Girish Karnad does the role of a veterinary surgeon. In my own assessment, this is one of the best films that has been shown, particularly capturing the caste conflict in the society. And the last film I would like to mention is a film which we saw together in 1979, Undanandu Kaladali, Once Upon a Time. And this was based on a great movie by Akira Kurosawa, the great Japanese director, Akira Kurosawa, Seven Samurai. But the interesting thing about this particular film is that Girish Karnad brings out that even amongst warriors, you have an ethics. We see the conflict today going on in Ukraine and Russia. The whole issue is not killing of, killing of the forces. It is killing of innocent people, the collateral damage. So therefore, Seven Samurai beautifully captures how in war you must always avoid minimizing, collateral damage. This particular film got the Silver Award for Shankar Nag in the 7th International Film Festival. Next. Now, which are the influences Karnad had? I had already mentioned he was hugely impacted by Jean-Paul Sartre, Kafka, Camus, and Thomas Mann. And he was also greatly influenced by Bertolt Brecht, particularly his use of charm, mixing natural and supernatural and magical realism. And Nagamandala, the play that I mentioned, was hugely influenced by the great work of Simone de Beauvoir, who wrote that great book called The Second Sex. He was also greatly influenced by Satyajit Ray. As you know, that he was the Renaissance man of Indian cinema, and he would be always remembered for the Apu trilogy. But in turn, Ray was also hugely influenced by Italian neorealism of De Sica in Bicycle Thief, 1948, and also River by John Renoir. Now, both these people, both these Renaissance men, were deeply influenced by Western Renaissance, but very interestingly used indigenous roots, indigenous medium to showcase their creativity. It was just not, they were not copycats. They imbibed interesting Western ideas, but they applied it with the indigenous language and indigenous flavor. Next. I end with the last two slides. This is the autobiography of Girish Karnad, Life at Play. If you haven't read it, please do read it. Now, very interestingly, Girish Karnad was born in Dharwad when the city hardly had any rights, and it had a lot of power cuts. But he writes that it is darkness. When darkness descends, the stories roll out. So darkness was very natural to him because he was a man of theater. Because he says that in the theater, when the light goes off, the stories roll out. He was a very, very strong activist. He was never a fence sitter. He never sat quiet. He publicly condemned the demolition of Babri Masjid. He wrote an open letter against hate politics. He went to Ayodhya in 1993 with about 100 artists, including Sitara Devi, the dancer, and Kelucharan Mahapatra, to Ramki Padi Ghats. And they ensured that it was a lifelong performance until the place was completely rid of vandals. They performed. He lasted out V.S. Naipaul, the Nobel laureate, for being very critical towards Indian Muslims. He protested against communalization of Baba Budhangir's shrine in Chikmagalur in 2004. His main objective, why I call him the last Renaissance man, was to foster multiculturalism. And he writes in his autobiography that he looks forward to a diverse and equal India. Not an equal India, diverse and equal India. We keep on talking of unity and diversity. He puts it differently. And he wore this particular placard saying that I am an urban Naxal, to commemorate the first death anniversary of Gauri Lankesh, the journalist who was brutally murdered in front of her residence because she wrote against the rising Hindu fundamentalism which was there. And I was present on 10th June in 2019 when he died in Bangalore. It was a coincidence, and the city was quiet. But he insisted that there should be no floral procession, no VVIPs, and this was respected by the state government. I end with this particular slide. Next, I end with this. What are my final thoughts on this? Now, very interestingly, we started by discussing about Raja Rammohun Roy, and as I said, I think that Tagore, Satyajit Ray were his proud successors, and the quartet is complete with Girish Karnad. But very interestingly, there was a thread which connected all the four. Now, Rammohun Roy, just like Rammohun Roy, delved into Indian texts. Girish Karnad also looked into ancient texts. Just as Tagore believed that freedom of speech and expression is powerful, is very, very important. Just as Tagore believed that there should be no domestic walls between us, there should be the clear stream of reason should not be run over by dreary desert sand of dead habits. So Karnad also believed that freedom of speech and expression is paramount. And he also had this wonderful link with Satyajit Ray for his realism and adherence to regional roots. I end by saying that there's a wonderful book by Joseph Nye, Soft Power by Joseph Nye. He wrote in 2004, where he says that the future of society is not hard power, is not military power. It is cultural power, the power of culture, the power of political values, the power of foreign policies. So therefore, the way forward for the world is not basically hard power, not ramming your tanks or your missiles on a hapless population, but how to co-opt rather than coerce. And therefore it's extremely, extremely important that culture is something which unites. I thought I'll just mention to all of you that in India, we started this by having a Sangeet Natakala Academy in 1953. The NSD came up in 1959, the FTI in 1960. Then in Bhopal, you have the Bharat Bhavan in 1953. And then very interestingly, we had Nandan in Calcutta in 1985. I do not know how many people know that the logo of Nandan was designed by Satyajit Ray. He was ailing, but I had the good fortune, Professor Goel Jugal, to meet Satyajit Ray watching Andre Vazda's conductor in Nandan. So therefore, we need to invest in culture. Very sadly, you go all over the world. You go to London, you see Royal Albert Hall. You go to US, you see Broadways. You go to France, it is brimming with cultural activity. You go to Germany, Berlin is bursting with cultural activities. And very sadly, as a country, we hardly invest in culture. There has been no public investment on cultural institutions after 1960. It's such a tragedy because, it is culture and sports which unite people. So Professor Goswami mentioned about the difficult times, the divisive times that we are going through, and the tunnel vision that many of us today are getting into. So therefore, as I end, let me hope that the great liberal ideas of this great Renaissance men, whether it is Raja Rammohun Roy, Tagore, Ray, or Girish Karnad, hopefully will permeate into the thinking of people, and we see a more tolerant, more vibrant, more culturally rich India in the days to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Mishra, for this wonderful speech about all the insuppressions of India. It was really a delight hearing you. Up next, we'll be having a short Q&A session. So if anyone is having any questions that they want to ask to our speakers, please feel free to raise their hands, and then we can go by one after one answering the questions.
May I, Deepan sir, may I ask a question, sir?
Yes, ma'am, sure.
Thank you. This question is to Professor Mishra. I just wanted to, first of all, I just wanted to make a minor correction in your PPT, sir. That film is Manthan. It's not Nishant, where we are talking about. Yes, yes.
Yeah, my apologies.
It's not Nishant. Nishant is another Shambhanagal film, but this is Manthan. Yes, sir. Now my question is primarily on Girish Karnad, sir. And can you just tell me how he delved into not just cinema, his theater, then also television? He tapped into that medium with, we saw Swami and his friends. He was the father in R.K. Narayan's that was television serial. So he delved into all these aspects of telling a story, not just in theater and then in cinema, then in television as well, which was very new at the time when he came up with Swami and his friends. So how do you think he tapped into all the medium and kept them relevant culturally at that time?
Amongst the filmmakers, Satyajit Ray's Ghatak, there is always a debate that Ghatak had a background of theatre, which Satyajit Ray didn't have. So many people believe that that way Karnad was a complete person, So in fact, when Sanskar got the National Award, Satyajit Ray, he bet Satyajit Ray in Pratidwandi, 1970. So he said, I don't mind to be bitten because, Girish is a great theatre man. So therefore, I have seen that those people who had a wonderful background in theatre, whether it is Nasiruddin Shah or Sabana Azmi, so they have generally they have done extremely well in the film genre. But I would also hasten to add that if you want a comparison between Karnad the script writer and the Karnad the actor, I would say the script writer wins. So that's my personal opinion. But that doesn't take away, his wonderful acting in Malgudi Days. Does extremely well, or in Sanskar. But compared to his script writing, he possibly was not as good. And in fact, when Ray was forced to ask how much he liked Sanskar, he said the first part was delightful, and when Girish comes, the second part degenerates. It peters out. So anyway, this is the assessment of the master. But as I said, he was a theatre man foremost, and that really helped him in the other mediums.
Thank you so much, sir.
Up next, we do have a question from Dr. Rashmi Gautam in the chat. Ma'am, is the question directed to anyone in particular, or does anyone of the speakers would like to answer the question?
Dr. Rashmi's question is, वैश्विक दौर में क्षेत्रीय भाषाई पत्रकारिता की महत्व कम होने की क्या कारण है? डॉक्टर रश्मि, मैं तो स्वीकार ही नहीं करता हूं कि भाषाई पत्रकारिता की महत्व कम हुआ है. In fact, all the figures, statistics that we have right now in India points to the opposite. Look at the circulation figure, look at the impact figure, look at any which way. भाषाई पत्रकारिता जो 20 साल पहले जिस मुकाम पे था, उस मुकाम से बहुत आगे बढ़ रहा है, ये मेरा मानना है. But one thing probably bothers many of us is that the intellectual input that we find in English media, probably some language media cannot match that, or is not up to that level. Many of the readers do feel that, but it's catching up very fast. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
So, Mr. Gautam Shah would like to ask a question.
Sir, I have a question to the speakers. It was a very enriching sessions, and I was wondering there was a book of Madison, is a history of world economy, where Dr. Madison told that in 1700, 24% of the world income was contributed by India. India was such rich in terms of knowledge, in terms of business. However, but India declined because of all we know about the English imperialism. So my question is that perhaps whether Renaissance, when we become focused too much on Renaissance, probably as a nation, haven't we forgot our own strength, our own culture, which at that time were very superior. Perhaps in 1700, India was the ruler, but probably we have not explored that knowledge because of too much focus of Renaissance. That is my humble thinking. But I just want to ask to this very respected, panel members.
Professor Goswami, would you like to take this? Or Dr. Ramakrishna? Mrinal, otherwise, Professor Mrinal, you can take it.
If Dr. Shah, I do not think that Renaissance kind of impeded the prosperity metrics of India. I mean, the notion that India was prosperous, and it's just because of the Renaissance which brought in English education and notion of liberalism and etc. India became poor. It's this narrative. I don't think it has historical. It has historical facts to match this kind of narrative, right? Maybe this needs a wider platform and probably time to discuss. But I don't subscribe to this this narrative. Thank you.